Welcome and good afternoon. We would like to start with our K-State Garden Hour series. We thank you for joining us today. This series is hosted by K-State Research and Extension. My name is Kelsey Hattisall, and I am the horticulture agent for the River Valley District. I will be serving as your host for today. Before we get started, we do have a couple housekeeping notes that we'd like to let you know about. We have switched from a Zoom license to a webinar license. So we do have a Q&A feature in this webinar for you to ask your questions. Please use the Q&A relate for questions. Our moderator, Dennis Patton, who is the horticulture agent for Johnson County, will be keeping track of those questions that come in, and we will do our best to get through all the questions at the end of the presentation. In the event that we do not answer all of them, we will be uploading additional resources for you on our Horticulture and Natural Resources website. This will serve as a great reference after the presentation. You will also be able to access today's presentation on that website. This webinar will be recorded, and we will be posting it on the website, as well as the previous topics and the upcoming webinars on that website as well. The events in this series have been posted on the K-State Horticulture and Natural Resources Facebook page. You can stay tuned in there to what's going on within our department, as well as stay up to date on the upcoming topics within this series. Be sure to like, share, and use the hashtag K-State Garden Hour to help us promote this program. This webinar series has allowed us to continue to provide extension, education-related horticulture and gardening topics, given the circumstances we are in today. Everyone involved in the development of this series is an extension professional for K-State. Most of us have a background in horticulture education or related discipline, but most of all, we each have a love for gardening and the natural environment. We have recently added several events to the series and have an exciting month ahead. We will continue to do a week-to-week schedule through the end of September. Today's topic is growing fall vegetables, excuse me. I am pleased to introduce our speaker today, Tom Buehler. He is the horticulture agent for Douglas County. Give us a couple moments while we transition to Tom's presentation.
All right. Hopefully everybody's seeing my presentation. Good, just barely afternoon, everybody. My name is Tom Buehler. I am the horticulture extension agent in Douglas County. So that's the county surrounding Lawrence. So in northeast Kansas, in between Kansas City and Topeka. So today I'm going to talk about growing fall vegetables. Now is really a great time to be doing that. I started growing vegetables in Kansas about 14 years ago, and I did start out in the fall. And the gentleman who I consider my gardening mentor, Mark Lumpy, who runs Wakarusa Valley Farm here in Lawrence, told me that the time to start planting fall vegetables was in the first cold snap or cool snap, I guess, in August. So sometimes these days it seems like that comes in July, but we are definitely in the midst of a cool snap up here in northeast Kansas. So now is the perfect time to be getting your vegetables going. I'm going to walk through some growing season information, just talk a real kind of conceptual level about what we consider sort of the 3 growing seasons in Kansas. I'll talk about why fall is a different time to grow vegetables in Kansas, highlight some of the differences that will affect how you grow things and what you grow. I'll talk a little bit about season extension. That's something I could give a whole talk about and be happy to answer as many questions as we have time for at the end about that. But just give a little quick dive into season extension, both just extending the season a little bit and also really extending the season, trying to grow some stuff for winter. I'll talk a little bit about garden prep. So what do we need to do? So to get ready for fall gardening. And then I'm going to go through kind of a planting calendar and not day by day, but roughly time periods of the fall, when to plant what. And talk a little bit about garden cleanup, which isn't necessarily directly related to vegetables, but it's something good to do at the end of the year. So with that, that's kind of an overview of where I'm going to go. And in general, I like to think of the course of this talk going from sort of the conceptual, theoretical to the hands-on applied. So we'll start and try and give you some understanding about fall and how it's unique as a season, and then we'll just get down to the nitty gritty of when to plant what. So Kansas, we really like to consider, has 3 growing seasons, 2 cool seasons and a warm season. So spring is a cool season, then comes summer, and it's a warm season. And then we come into fall, which we list as also a cool season, but it does have some very critical differences from spring. And those are that, the soils coming into the period are already warm, and the temperatures are also warm, and both of those things are kind of cooling down. So if you think about the spring growing season, you start off with cool soils that are warming up and generally cool air temperatures that are warming up. I mean, air temperatures are all over the place. But that's the general trend. And then in fall, it's the reverse of that. So while we talk about cool season crops and warm season crops, so there's a lot of overlap between what we grow in the spring and in the fall, those general dynamics of soil temperature and air temperature are going to affect how we grow that. I like to think of the fall as a bonus season because in addition to getting those cool season crops, which is what I really spend most of the time talking about today, what to plant now for fall vegetables, you kind of get that bonus in that you still have the warm season crops going. So I have a picture here from a farmer's market here in Lawrence, a farmer's market stand. And I like this just because this picture was taken in early October, and it really shows, like, I guess, the full power of fall gardening, because here you have fresh lettuce alongside sweet potatoes, winter squash, regular potatoes, peppers, tomatoes, eggplant, some baby cut greens, some turnips, all kinds of different things. So fall is really great because you can get the full spectrum of garden produce. Early in the spring, you get some nice leafy greens, but if you want a tomato, you're out of luck unless you're buying it from a grocery store or a hydroponic producer. But in the fall, you can have all of those things coming out of your garden at the same time. So it's really a great time. So I would like to ask a quick poll here just to see who's in the audience. So we'll wait just a couple minutes here. If you want to click on that, I'd like to know who's gardening and if you've gardened in the fall before. All right, the votes are slowing down to a trickle, so I'm going to go ahead and close that. And so it's some interesting dynamics there. So over half of you have never grown vegetables in the fall before. A good chunk of you, 60% of you, have more than 10 years gardening experience. So hopefully I'll still be able to teach you something, but possibly not. And then we do have a little over 10% that are 11% there that this is their first year gardening. So welcome if this is your first year gardening. Fall, I think, is the best time of year to garden in Kansas. Maybe I've made that abundantly clear, but if this is your first year, welcome, and hopefully we can get you going well. All right, now. There we go. So I talked a little bit about the sort of top level difference of why fall is a little bit of a different season to garden in. But we'll go down, I'll run through some more specific areas. So what's different in the fall? And I'll dive into these in detail, each of them. So weed pressure is definitely different in the fall. Insect pressure can be different in the fall. Plant establishment, there'll be some slightly different techniques or slightly modifications to how you would normally establish plants that we'll do in the fall. Different crop selection. I'll put up some slides on choosing crops for the fall, and that difference takes place on a couple of different levels. So we're not just looking at probably any cool season vegetable, and when we're thinking about which vegetables to choose, we might be choosing different varieties also. You know, the fall season has a different end game. So we are not moving into warmer periods. We are moving into frosts and freezes. So that's definitely going to be a factor in how you do fall gardening. I think fall gardening requires a little bit more planning, a little bit more forethought, because there are some hard deadlines that are coming up if you have frost sensitive crops. And we don't know exactly when those are, but they are definitely coming. And something else that I think is a challenge, and maybe why a lot of people haven't grown vegetables in the fall, is burnout. And I'm not going to really talk about that in any detail, except to say, you know, if you started growing vegetables in the spring, the weeds got away from you, or it was really hot in the summer and you're just, you know, tired of being outside and it's hot. Fall is a great time to refresh yourself, maybe go knock down all those weeds, till under the debris, whatever, but you can get a fresh garden start. So I know a lot of people start the spring with a lot of energy and enthusiasm for gardening. And for a lot of people, this time of year, that enthusiasm is waning. Maybe not so much this year since we're having such a cool spell. It's nice to get outside. But definitely, you know, if you can power through it, fall gardening can be great, even if you're feeling a little tired of dealing with all the weeds and everything at this point. It'll get better. Okay, so I'm going to talk about most of those points in a little bit more detail. Talking about weed pressure in the fall. Fall is very different dynamics than the spring, and this is kind of the tale of two pictures here. So the picture on the left, that is not that, you know, nice baby cut lettuce that I had on my first slide. That is actually a solid sea of little pigweed babies. So this was a picture that I took in someone's garden in early August. So they had tilled it in preparation for planting, and those warm soils of the fall, we got some rain, and some weeds that they had previously let go to seed just took over. So you can see early in the fall season, you're going to have pretty intense weed pressure. We've got warm soils, some of those aggressive weeds like pigweed, or maybe Johnson grass, any of those real nasty warm season weeds, they can germinate in those warm soils. So you probably have kind of intense weed pressure early in the season. So when you're thinking about planting a fall garden, you want to think about how to control those early on. So one great technique to deal with something like that sea of pigweed is what we call stale seed bedding. So that would be preparing your garden as if you were going to plant it. Let all those little weed seeds germinate, like you have a nice sea there. And if you go through with a hoe and shallowly cultivate those, or some other way, you know, if you're using herbicide, you can kill all of those weed seedlings, and then you plant, and the plants that come up after that will have that many fewer weeds to compete against. So stale seed bedding is kind of letting the seed bed germinate its first flush of weeds, then killing those, and then planting. So that works well if you start a little bit earlier than now for many things, but there are some things, if you went out and set up a stale seed bed now, there will be things you can plant in 2 or 3 weeks. You still have time. So if you do have garden areas that have had extreme weed pressure in the past, you might want to consider that, just to make a fall gardening a little bit easier. And then on the right side, we have a row there. The bigger stuff that's in that row is spinach. The smaller little things that have kind of purpley round leaves, that is actually henbit, which you probably notice most in the spring when you drive by a field and it's solidly purple. That is henbit that has taken over. But this picture was taken in the middle of September in someone's garden. And, you know, henbit isn't a terribly aggressive weed in the fall. So they planted their spinach and it came up alongside the henbit there. And the spinach will easily outcompete that. So, you know, things you plant later in the fall will have a lot less weed pressure to deal with. Those really aggressive warm season weeds, they won't be germinating nearly as much. So if you had that spinach and it was growing, you know, the pigweed that's on the left side would just absolutely hide the spinach, and you wouldn't get much of a crop without really aggressive weed control. Whereas if you wait a little bit, the weed pressure will go down. So that's the big dynamic. As those soils cool down, the weed pressure changes. We get generally less aggressive weeds germinating. Another thing that changes in the fall, and this isn't true for every insect, but I feel like in general, insect pressure is a little bit less in the fall, and that's certainly true for certain specific examples. So here I have a picture that's the life cycle of the Japanese beetle, and there's little tick marks at the bottom, and those tick marks are for each month of the year. And what you see is that the Japanese beetle spends much of its life underground, eating the roots of your grass. But then in June and July, it is above ground feeding on almost anything. I mean, they certainly have things they prefer, but I've seen Japanese beetles eat a lot of different things. So if you're in a part of the state like me and here in the Northeast, where Japanese beetles are a huge problem, some of the spring crops I grow, they really like to eat. So if I have a Chinese cabbage that's kind of a later season Chinese cabbage I've planted and it's coming into maturity in the middle or end of June, right when these Japanese beetles are emerging, I've seen them, turn one of those into lace in 2 days. So they can be a huge pest, but they're not going to be a big pest in our fall gardens. I did go out last night and find one in my garden, but they're on their way out. Other pests, sometimes flea beetles are a lot of problems on leafy greens, and I, in general, notice that flea beetles are less of a problem in the fall. I'm not sure the reason for that, but in general, a lot of insect pressure decreases. That's not true of every insect. I've noticed pretty uniform amounts of damage from, cabbage loopers in spring and fall, but a lot of pests have different seasons, so you might get away with having less insect pressure in the fall. Plant establishment's going to be a little bit different process in the fall, not much, but warm soils create this opportunity and some challenges. So we've talked about probably the main challenge that warm soil provides for us, and that is those really aggressive weeds will germinate very quickly. But the nice opportunity is that a lot of things that you plant will germinate very quickly also. Things still take different amounts of time, so a carrot's going to germinate relatively quickly for a carrot this time of year, but it's still going to be a lot slower than a bean. Another challenge with plant establishment is in a normal year, July is pretty dry in Kansas, or in a lot of parts of Kansas. So you usually are coming into the fall season with maybe a deficit of moisture in the soil, and that can definitely create challenges, especially if we get high temperatures, soil that's kind of dry, and you're trying to establish seedlings. That can be a real hard thing. So the solution is, maybe put those seeds just a little bit deeper than you would, so they're not quite on that top level of soil that's baking, and make sure you keep your seedlings well watered. That is probably the primary thing you need to do differently in the fall, is just really pay attention to that water. Right now, it's really cool. Our soils are moist here in Douglas County, so it's a little bit less of a concern than it would be in normal years, but you do have to really pay attention to that. So watch the temperature, watch the amount of precipitation you've had, and act accordingly. So it's been cool, but if we get temperatures that return up to the mid 90s, and we don't get rain for a couple of weeks, if you have little seedlings, you're going to need to get out there and water them. I know some people that do it twice a day, maybe daily, maybe every other day. It just kind of depends, but you really have to keep an eye on those conditions, because those warm soils and in general dry weather is a lot more stressful for young seedlings in the fall. The spring's a little bit more forgiving in that regard. And so also, if you're starting transplants or purchasing transplants from somewhere, you need to make sure that they're used to field conditions. So I'd like to start my own transplants for the fall. In general, a lot of places have less availability of transplants in the fall. You can generally find some at local garden centers, probably less at any of the big box stores, depending on where you're getting your gardening transplants in the main season. So I like to start transplants so I have a selection of what I want to grow available. But once you're doing those, when I start those, usually in July, I'll do it in the shade because a little flat of transplants would cook out in the full sun of July on most days. So I start it in the shade, keep them well watered. But then as we're getting ready to plant those out into the field, we need to make sure they're hardened off, just like we would in the spring, but make sure they're used to that full sun. If you've had them in a little bit of shade to keep them cooler, make sure that, they're used to the wind. In a lot of places in Kansas, the wind is a constant problem. So making sure that those plants are ready for the field before you go stick them out in the field is really important in the fall as well as in the spring, because it's really, once you get out in the garden, even if it's really nice, like right now, it's about 75 degrees where I'm at. It'd be a beautiful day to put out some transplants. If in 3 or 4 days we're at mid 90s and they're not used to being out in the full sun, they'll just cook. So you really have to baby your plants in the fall. Make sure they're really happy when you put them out in the field. And once they're out there, just make sure you keep them well watered. So I'll talk a little bit about fall crop selection in a broad sense. I'm not going to really talk about any specific varieties. A lot of that's up to you, what's available to you. I will talk about a little bit how to choose some varieties. But in general, most of the things you grow in the spring, those cool season crops, you can also grow in the fall. So we're talking about things like lettuce, leafy greens, radishes, turnips, broccoli, cabbage, and even beans and squash. So those are at the tail end there. And I'll talk about planting seasons, but they're kind of, you wouldn't plant them early in the spring, those beans and squash. Likewise, you won't plant them late in the fall because they're more of a summer crop, but they're kind of a crossover and they're relatively quick to grow. So you can get a crop if you plant them in the fall often. There are some things that are generally better in the spring. So planting peas, they like cool soils, so they don't germinate quite as well in the fall season or when you would be planting them for the fall season. And potatoes are a little bit similar. Some people do grow potatoes for the fall. I'll talk a little bit about some techniques for that, but they are something that I feel like is just pretty dramatically easier to grow in the spring. So if it was up to me, I would much rather grow enough potatoes for the year in a larger spring planting rather than holding some and planting them later. All right. And so beyond just choosing what types of crops you want to grow in your garden, fall crop selection can be really important. So here I've got 2 different varieties of broccoli. I stole these and the descriptions of them from Johnny's Seeds there, johnnyseeds.com. Not endorsing them, just want to let you know where I'm taking the images from. But anyway, so you decide you want to grow broccoli in the fall. Which is a good crop to grow in the fall. Some people say fall is the best time to grow broccoli in Kansas. But if you look at these 2 different varieties, they're not equally suited for fall production. So you have Imperial on top there, which in the description from their catalog, the top line of that, best heat tolerance. And then it describes the heads. And often, however, it's grown in late fall harvest in California and Arizona. That does not mean it's suited for fall production here in Kansas. Often, especially if you're ordering seeds from other places, they'll have descriptions of the plants that don't really suit Kansas's environment. So a heat-tolerant broccoli like this would be much better for spring production in Kansas because the broccoli plants start out small, and as they're in that stage where they're setting that head or building up, moving into the floral production stage, that's when they need that heat tolerance. So growing a variety like Imperial in the spring, as we're moving into a hotter time in Kansas, would be good because it's tolerant of that heat, which can make a lot of broccolis turn bitter if we get an early hot snap in Kansas, which is one of the challenges of growing broccoli in the spring here. Versus the second variety, their Marathon, which is best for overwinter production. So this late variety is highly tolerant to cold. grown successfully in Northeast for late summer and fall crops and over winter in Florida and California. So, this tolerance to cold is really something you'd want for more of a fall produced broccoli, because we are moving, if you plant broccoli now, it's going to be maturing in a time period where, the odds are higher that it will experience some cold. So in addition to choosing what types of crops to grow, when you're choosing crops, really look for those words. So, things that you want to grow in the spring or late in the spring, heat tolerance is going to be more important there, whereas cold tolerance will be more important for things you're planting now. The real difference in all of this is kind of the end game of the fall season, and this isn't going to be the end of fall vegetable production, but this first fall freeze changes everything really. So here's a average date from the agronomy on Mesonet. They took the average date of the first fall freeze across the state. So I don't know what part of the state you're listening from, so you can sort of look at those date ranges and see as they apply to you. Ours, I feel like, maybe in my memory of gardening, I would give it a little bit wider. I'm in the October 14th to 16th range there. But I think I would probably say, I'm thinking maybe October 10 through 20 is kind of the general window of when that fall freeze is in my mind. So you're going to want to come up with that for your location. And then a lot of fall gardening is kind of counting backwards. So what you're going to be able to plant when is a sort of mixture of how sensitive that crop is to cold temperatures, frost and freeze especially, and how long it takes to grow. So we'll get into those details and talk about those timing cycles a little bit, but that really is something that you have to think about a lot in the fall. And the interesting thing is, and I'll talk a little bit about this in season extension, but here we often will get this first fall freeze, and maybe we have 2 nights where it gets cold, and then we'll have 2 weeks after that where the weather's nice, and we don't get another freeze, or a week after that. So it might be something to think about if you're feeling adventurous. You can try and extend the harvest a little bit with some season extension. So that's really the next topic then. If you do want to extend the harvest a little bit, I'll talk about season extension. This first slide, I'm just going to go into really trying to buy maybe those extra few days or those extra couple of weeks. And then I'll talk a little bit about winter production on the next slide. Technically, we call all of that season extension in the vegetable production world, but we'll just talk about this, thinking about just extending the season a little bit here. So you can add a few weeks to harvest. Like I said, here we usually get, maybe between 1 and 3 nights where we'll have a cold snap, and we'll get temperatures that dip down maybe to 30 degrees. And if you can figure out some way to help your plants survive that, or the plants that are frost sensitive or freeze sensitive to survive that little dip, you often get 2 more weeks of nice temperatures. So floating row cover, like I've got in the picture here, usually provides a little bit of protection. So depending on the thickness you get, it'll provide maybe between 2 and 4 degrees of frost protection. And it's basically just trapping that warm air from the ground, trapping your plants with that, and not letting that frost settle down on those plants by kind of insulating them with the ground. You do want to use ideally some kind of hoop or something to keep it off the leaves a little bit, because if it's just sitting on the leaves, often there will be some condensation and it can freeze onto the leaves. Even if the airspace underneath is warm enough that your plants would survive, you can get a little bit of leaf burn, which isn't really a problem maybe if you want to throw some of this over some green beans or something like that. A little bit of leaf burn isn't a huge deal on those. But if you are trying to grow greens to eat, especially if they're mature and ready to harvest, so you have a bunch of heads of lettuce that are ready to harvest, if you let that row cover freeze to those heads, even though the lettuce would survive that cold just fine, you can get some tip burn on the greens. So keeping that row cover off of leaf contact is really ideal. Winter harvest is also possible in Kansas. And again, this is something that we could dive into for a couple hours. But just really briefly to give you an idea of what's possible, I'm standing there. I did not grow either of those 2 heads of lettuce, but those 2 heads of lettuce were grown by my neighbor. This picture was in December 16th, I believe, and the air temperature while I'm standing there holding them is 0 degrees. So we had a real cold spell that December, but my neighbor was growing, full-size, beautiful heads of romaine lettuce right up till there. So if you want to grow stuff for winter harvest, and some things are winter frost tolerant, so lettuces, a number of leafy greens, kale, spinach, those kinds of things are really not super sensitive to frost or freezes. You really want to grow those crops to the mature size by the middle of November. So in the middle of November, we lose enough daylight that plants aren't really growing very much at any point. So if you start with little things, even if they say, this is a 45-day lettuce, if you start with little lettuces in the middle of November, by January, they might just be a little bit bigger because we just don't have enough light for them to take off very well. They do better if you have some supplemental heating, but in general, if you want to grow without a greenhouse, if you just want to grow some crops for winter harvest, you want to grow them to full harvest size by mid-November. So you want to start your clock there. And you really want to provide substantial cover. So I think everyone that's growing greens for harvest in the winter, you usually want to do 2 layers. So maybe a low layer of row cover, and then people will have like a little greenhouse or something like that on top, a high tunnel, to provide a second layer of cover. So just 1 layer of cover or even 2 layers of cover closely stacked doesn't quite do it. But if you have a space for a small greenhouse or a little hoop house, and then that cover on that isn't enough, you need another layer of row cover over it, and you can grow greens all winter. But again, you got to keep the cover off the leaves, otherwise you're going to get those leaves sticking and getting tip burn on them. 2 layers is best. And the other thing, if you are trying to do this winter harvest, I know people that have done this in their gardens, you can make little low tunnels and then have row cover under and over that. You have to make sure that the temperature's above freezing when you harvest it, because if the crop's frozen, it will look really nice. Then you harvest it and you go wash your lettuce, it'll just turn to mush. It'll look beautiful as it's frozen, but then it'll turn to mush. But if you let the temperature in that warm up to a day when it's above freezing and you harvest it, the crop will be just fine. So with that is kind of the theoretical overview of growing fall vegetables. I'll dive into the more the nitty-gritty details here. And so garden prep, to start fall seedlings, you really want to create a nice planting bed, but you want to avoid tillage if possible. I try and always say avoid tillage if possible, but especially going into the fall, if you have a garden that's reasonably nice to plant, that you've already grown things in, a lot of the weed seeds that are in that germination zone will have already sprouted and been killed by you in the spring. If you are prepping a new bed and you go through and rototill that, you're bringing up a whole new layer of weed seeds. So if you can avoid that, that's really ideal. It's also better for your soil health. If you have compost to add, that's a great addition now. It helps your soil hold moisture. So some of those concerns about, soils drying out with the warm temperatures, compost helps to mitigate that. Generally in the fall, if you've had an adequately fertilized garden and you're planting into that same garden space, generally pretty minimal additional fertilizer is needed. I would say the one sort of exception to that, if you're growing something that they often call a heavy feeder, so something like broccoli, it might need a little bit extra nitrogen. But in general, if you did a good fertilization in the spring, there's probably enough nutrients still in your garden to make it through the fall. All right, so now we'll talk about timing, and I realize this shows up probably pretty small on your screens, so I'm not, asking you to read the words here, but this is a chart that's available towards the back of the Kansas Garden Guide. I've got the link there on the slide. I think Dennis is going to put it in the chat also, but this kind of shows you the seasons of when to plant things and when to harvest things in Kansas. So the boxes that are just outlined in black is the planting time, and then the blocks that are solid black with the letters in white is the harvest time. So as you can see here, looking at early August, the things that this would tell us to plant are beets, carrots, broccoli, endive, cauliflower. Moving into the time we can plant kale, lettuce. Looks like we missed potatoes according to this. And I'll talk through these things in a little bit more detail, but this gives you a general sense of when to plant things. And these windows are a little bit wider or smaller, again, depending on varieties, where you're at, how long it is until that killing frost, and what you're looking at growing. So on this chart here down towards the bottom, you see that the squash planting window is in May and winter squash is in June. Actually, if you get a short variety of squash, you could plant that now and you'd be harvesting squash before frost, at least here in Northeast Kansas. So, not everything on this chart is correct. Or there's other options, I guess. This chart doesn't show all the options. You could plant spinach now and you might get away with it. This shows you planting it at the end of August and into September. You could also plant it a little bit later. So I'll talk through some of that, but this provides a good backdrop. And so you can go to the Kansas Garden Guide. It's actually got a full chapter on fall gardening. That's a really great chapter. And it shows you this, if you don't want to take notes rapidly while I talk here. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what to plant and when from my perspective. And we're going to start a few weeks ago. So we'll think about early to mid-July. And this is, not going to be helpful for this year, obviously, but for future years, if you want to garden in the fall, here's some things you can consider. This is a good time to start transplants of broccoli, cabbage, Brussels sprouts, etc. In general, transplants in the fall don't take quite as long to grow. So probably, after 4 weeks, these transplants would be ready to set out in the field, just because they'll get going faster. But you do need to get those going because most of these now would be the right time to start putting those out in the field. If you're doing beans and summer squash, you could be doing succession plantings of those. And if you did want to grow potatoes for fall production, July is kind of the time to do it. Now, the problem with potatoes is they don't like soil that's that hot, and our soils are hot in July. So the person I know that's grown fall potatoes most successfully, his technique would be to plant potatoes in July, and he would have mulched the beds ahead of time and put them in the mulch to try and keep the soil cool. And then as we move into September, when you're trying to keep the soil warm long enough for those tubers to size up, he'd pull the mulch off of it. So you're trying to kind of fight the natural direction of soil temperatures using mulch. So it's a couple extra steps, but it is possible. Okay, so that's the early season that we've moved past. So now I'll talk about the window that we're in. So the end of July to early August, what can you plant? So I think you could still squeeze in a last planting of beans or summer squash. What you really want to do on these though is check the label for days to maturity. So if I'm talking about a frost that's coming in my area sometime between October 10th and 20th, you need to think that that's, maybe roughly 60 days out from here. So there are some varieties that are 50 days. So if you get, if I get a frost on the 20th, you could have 20 days of harvest if you get a 50-day variety. So you're not going to get a full season of production out of the beans or summer squash, but if you really want those and you haven't gotten them out of your garden yet, I think you might be able to still squeeze those in, especially if you're in the southern part of the state. And if you haven't ever grown beans in the fall, wow, they are super tasty, and it's really just nice to go out and pick them when it's cool. Now is a good time to start field plantings of those cool season direct seeded crops. So this is when I was learning how to garden here. My mentor said, start planting the first cool snap in August. This is the stuff he was talking about. So things like beets and carrots, turnips. You could start planting greens out there. You could plant spinach. You have to keep these well watered, just because the seeds will dry out relatively quickly. But especially with the spinach, I just threw in a word of caution there because it's really sensitive to high soil temperatures. And I see a lot of people with germination failures on spinach if they plant it in August when it's still hot. So we've been cool here for almost a week. So I think I could easily get some spinach to germinate now. But if I was going to plant them and it was 95 degrees and it had been, I'd really want to maybe water the area really well, probably for a couple days before planting to try and bring that soil temperature down a little bit. Everything else germinates pretty well in regardless of the temperature, but spinach is really sensitive to those warm temps. If you have those transplants that you started, if they're ready to go, you can go out and plant them. Or if you can find some in your garden center, you can go out and plant them. So I have a couple pictures here. The top right one is some lettuce transplants that my wife started on Sunday, actually, and I took that picture this morning, so they're popping pretty fast. There is still time to start some transplants of things like head lettuce, maybe bok choy or some other greens that have a little bit shorter season. So things that are maybe in the 45-day range versus something that's in 50 or 60. But now is a good time. I took the bottom picture there yesterday. That is our Master Gardener demonstration garden, and they have some kale transplants that they've just put out there. I know folks that have tried to what we call over summer kale, and the plants survive, but they never really bounce back in the fall. So if you want good fall kale, I would suggest replanting. All right, so now moving into the next time window, kind of mid-August to mid-September, what can you plant? You can continue those field plantings of hardy leafy greens and radishes, things like that. So here we have a picture that's from a community garden here in Lawrence, where you see the long stuff on the right. Those are little spinach seedlings that are popping up. And then there is some really too densely seeded radishes in the middle there. They'll need to thin those out for sure. But this picture was taken in the middle of September. So these things had just been planted. They will, radishes are really pretty short season, 24 day, 26 days. So they'll be good. They're also not super frost sensitive. They don't like really cold weather, but they'll survive some frosts. And spinach is good pretty much any time. And as you're moving, from, I guess, now until mid-September, you kind of maybe want to scale down your expectations for greens. So if you want the big leafy kale, planting a transplant now will get you that. If you're planting, like I say here, leafy green in mid-September, you're probably just going to get little baby cut kale, which is perfectly delectable, but if you're trying to get the big leaves, you needed to get an earlier start on that, but you can still grow greens getting things started this late. If you do have unused garden space, this time of year, mid-August to mid-September, is a great time to start cover crops. If you want more information on that, feel free to reach out to me. If I was starting gardening and wanted to fill this space then, if it was earlier, maybe throw in some buckwheat, that'd be fun. If it's a little bit later, maybe some oats, just to keep that garden soil covered. So as you move to that next time window here, what to plant and when, moving into October, into early November, this is really the time period when you're looking to plant things like garlic, shallots. You can plant spinach this late, and what's going to happen is you'll probably get the little spinach to germinate, and then it's just going to sit there because you'll reach that November growth window where it's going to stop growing, but those little seedlings will sit there, and then next spring, when it starts to warm up, they'll take off. So you'll have some early season spinach. It's good if you want to do that to provide some kind of cover. I've seen people sprinkle straw out across it or just lay row cover across it for the course of the winter. The leaves that are up probably aren't going to be the ones you're going to eat, so there will be a lot of burning on those, but they'll take off and have new growth in the spring. And so you could do some fall gardening that would get you the kickstart on your spring garden. You'd have the earliest greens around. Just a note, I'm not going to talk about garlic and shallots here, just because you didn't see the full schedule for the K-State Garden Hour. You just saw August, but coming up on September 9th there, we are going to have Chuck Oddie do a presentation on growing garlic. So if you want more information about growing these sort of late fall things that will be coming on next year, be sure to check in for that, because that'll be a great presentation. All right, with that, I just want to close up with a few thoughts on garden cleanup. And this is one of those, again, I guess a psychological point in gardening, but you will really, really like yourself a lot next spring if you take some time in the fall to clean up. I know sometimes it's hard to muster that energy if you've put a lot into your garden all year. But if you do it, you'll really appreciate yourself in the spring. So if you want to add organic matter or compost, which are generally great practices to build up your soil health, fall is a great time to do that. Even just laying it across the top of the surface, the winter has these freeze-thaw cycles that will kind of incorporate that a little bit better, or if you mix them in, even better. And it'll break those down a little bit over the winter. So it's a great time to do that. If you are planning on growing vegetables next year, and you know where you want to grow those early spring crops like peas and potatoes, working the ground in the fall is really good, because often it comes in the spring and it's time to plant potatoes and the soils are soaking wet, and that is not a good time to work the ground. So if the ground is ready to go, you'll appreciate yourself for that, rather than either doing a lot of damage to your soil or not getting the crops planted in a timely way. And cleaning up debris and residue can help your garden look good, but there are certain pests like squash bugs that like to overwinter in some of that residue. It is kind of a fine dance, because you do want to leave some organic matter, but maybe getting rid of squash debris and residue, and then covering your garden with a different kind of mulch to protect the soil surface, or a cover crop would be a great thing to do too. So just a quick note here at the end that if you can spare some energy to do that at the end of the season, you'll really appreciate it in the spring. With that, here again is the Kansas Garden Guide. It is a great resource for growing fall vegetables, a lot of good information in there. The chart I had earlier, as well as some more detailed directions on specific vegetables. And with that, I will open it up for questions. If you don't get your question answered today on the Garden Hour, feel free to reach out to me. I put my email up there too.
Tom, we do have a few questions.
Okay.
First, let's start with about using a light layer of straw mulch. Does that keep the soil moist but not shade the plants to delay germination?
Yeah, so that certainly can do that. I guess it depends on how light the layer is, but a very light layer of straw mulch would help protect the soil from drying out really quickly. I've actually seen people kind of accomplish the same thing using that floating row cover, not as frost protection, but just like if they plant something that needs consistent soil moisture to keep that top level a little bit more moist, so it doesn't evaporate with the wind quite as readily. That's really especially important, I would say, for things like carrots. Carrots really germinate very slowly, much slower than a lot of other crops. And they are pretty shallow in how shallow you plant them. And so that top layer of soil can dry out. So if you plant carrots, doing something like adding a little straw or a cover would really help. Otherwise, you need to go out there and probably water like once a day just to keep that top layer really moist enough for them to germinate.
Okay. Next question was, I know this is an extension agent, it's difficult to answer, but people are wanting some leads from some good seed companies they may be able to get some interesting new varieties from.
Interesting new varieties. Yeah.
Just good seed companies in general, maybe to order from.
Right. So I'm not sure how directly I can answer that. I suppose we're not supposed to endorse companies, but I'll provide a variety of names of companies I've had success with, and I guess whether you want to take that as endorsement or not. So I feel like Johnny's Seeds, which I put up earlier, I've had a lot of luck with them. I don't know that they always have necessarily the newest varieties. They do have a good selection, I would say, but the thing I like about them is I feel like I have pretty good germination success with the seeds I've purchased from them before. If you want stuff that's new and interesting, I always like to look at Baker Creek seeds. They have, really beautiful catalogs, but they have really interesting and unique stuff. I don't know how much of it's new, but I think they're actively, exploring areas around the world to come up with new to us varieties of things. So if you want to find some vegetable you've grown before, but you've never seen it purple, they might have it at Baker Creek. Likewise, Seed Savers Exchange is pretty good. Yeah, there's a lot of good vegetable companies out there. There's just a few, I guess, that I listed, but.
Okay. Next one was you talked about using a double layer of row cover for frost protection.
Yeah.
A little bit more in detail about how you do that without laying on the plants, how you support it, how you handle a double row cover.
Right. So in general, I think the people that do that, if you're really looking at winter production, you probably want to have a couple of different heights of hoops. Now, often people will do this in a commercial sense. They'll have a high tunnel and then use like a 2-foot tall hoop underneath that. I've also seen people suspend those with wires. But if you're looking at a smaller garden space, I've seen people make hoops out of PVC that you bend over. So you would need some kind of cover over that. And then maybe a smaller hoop. If you get like a number 9 gauge wire, you can make an adequate hoop. It'll stay up off your crops, and you could have just 2 layers of cover. Some people, really in the depths of winter, I guess, using the outer layer with a greenhouse plastic or some sort of UV protected plastic would be ideal. But in the rest of the winter, that's going to heat up really quickly, so you have to watch it and make sure you keep it ventilated. So I guess that's why I said, that's a whole nother talk I can give, because that ventilation and all that gets really complicated in winter production, but it is possible in Kansas.
So one of the questions, we kind of talked about it offline a little bit, but rest group might be, you talked about broccoli and the day lengths, those type of things. Do you have any really excellent broccoli recommendations to do well for fall production?
I have tried a lot of different types of broccoli. I haven't grown a lot of different varieties in the fall. In general, I would say my favorite all-around broccoli is probably Gypsy, which isn't maybe the best broccoli head, but I guess I'm a little bit stingy, I suppose, so I probably tend to under-fertilize things, and it's really good at foraging nutrients in my experience. So in low fertility situations, it will produce a better head than some other things. But otherwise, I think the one I put up there, I believe it was Diplomat, is a good one. I've heard people having good luck with too.
Okay. Kind of getting into a current pest problem. We've got someone on the line who's having problems with their bean foliage being chomped on this time of year. Any idea what that pest might be off the top of your head?
Depends on what kind of chomping they're seeing. We have some little beans that are coming up in my garden, and I saw a bunny out there this morning. So, it could be anything from bunnies or deer, or if it's holes. Yeah, I'm not sure if we're getting if we have any bean beetles that would be feeding this time of year. I don't believe so, but yeah, I don't know. You'd need pictures or something for that.
Yeah, that's sometimes hard. So question came up earlier about saving seeds from the garden. This one is specifically about gourds, but I think that might be a question we see about. So how about saving seeds?
Yeah, seed saving is a pretty complicated topic, and it's very plant dependent. So some plants you can save seeds relatively effectively from. So I'm thinking the easiest one probably out of the garden would be if you had an heirloom or open pollinated tomato, you could probably save those seeds. Tomatoes are self-pollinating. When you get something like gourds or anything in the cucurbit family, they will cross-pollinate. So they're fun to save the seeds and plant them, and what you get may or may not resemble the gourd you grew last year, but often, see people getting squash out of their compost pile or something like that. That's some sort of hybrid of the different kinds of squash they grew previous years. So in general, I mean, there are some kinds of seeds you can save easily, but there's usually something to do to kind of keep that true to form. Especially if you're growing a hybrid, then it's not going to be true to form, even if it doesn't cross. So.
Okay. First question, I think is going to be very hard to answer, but for those people that had the heavy torrential rains last week, you get garden crusting, those type of things. Do you have any tips how to handle crusting gardens after heavy rains, those type of things?
Yeah, that is definitely a big problem. I had that problem here too. So, planting in rows is usually good, and so if you get a real heavy crust, your options are to kind of disturb that crust mechanically. So going through and maybe lightly raking the soil surface. But another thing would be to sort of soften the soil. I've had it where, especially if you plant, I've had this on a number of occasions, plant some seedlings, you get that hard crust on top. That's where, even if you don't need the moisture underneath, just softening that soil surface with light irrigation, I guess, would allow the seeds to pop through. If you don't have anything planted there, just lightly disturbing it before planting would be good, using a rake or a heavy tined rake or something like that.
Okay. Next question has to do with the beans and peas being legumes. I think the question is, do they need to be fertilized? Do they need to be side dressed, or do they manufacture their own nitrogen?
Yeah, so in general, I mean, there's I guess different kinds of fertility. So if we're talking about nitrogen specifically, in general, those legumes don't need to be fertilized. If you haven't planted a lot of legumes in your soil, sometimes you can purchase an inoculant to mix with those seeds. And what that is the beans or peas have a symbiotic relationship with bacteria that fix the nitrogen for them. So you're inoculating them with that bacteria. If you have a heavy population in your soil from years of growing beans, you often don't need that. So in general, beans don't need additional nitrogen, but yeah, so they would be one of those things that you probably have adequate fertility in your garden if you have enough P and K from the spring.
Okay. This is kind of a cut flower question. Can you do sunflowers in the fall?
I think you just have to watch the season length. I think a lot of those would need a longer season than we've got time for. I know people that plant them in the summer and they're ready in the fall, but I don't think you could get away with them at this point.
Okay. Last question that's up, and I think we'll be out of time. It may be difficult to answer, but the person has a greenhouse, and the question is that she had ant colony brought in aphids, but actually my take would be the aphids came in, the ants followed them. But she's just wanting to know if there's any good non-pesticide recommendations for greenhouses.
For aphid control specifically, a lot of folks I know rely on biologicals. It takes a while to build up their populations, and it's not something that kind of works in the open field, but you can buy packages of ladybugs, which love to eat aphids. And so that's not a quick fix. Often there's some pretty, I guess, relatively innocuous pesticides that work on aphids and other soft body insects. So a insecticidal soap or something like that. But if you want a strictly no spray solution, buy a bunch of ladybugs.
And I think, Tom, the last is that we have just got a whole bunch of thank yous in the chat column about great information, good knowledge. People are asking about will the PDF or what will be available, and this is recorded so they can go back and view the recording, which will have all your PowerPoint slides on that.
Yep.
Okay. With that, I think I'll turn it back over to Kelsey because it's about 1 o'clock.
All right. Thank you, Dennis. And thank you, Tom, for sharing your knowledge on fall gardening today. Once again, thank you all for joining us today for the K-State Garden Hour series hosted by K-State Research and Extension. We are so glad that you could be here today to learn more about fall gardening vegetables. We have several awesome webinar series coming up. Be sure to visit our website for all the upcoming topics. Next week's topics is hummingbirds in Kansas. This session will be recorded and will be posted by tomorrow afternoon. After the webinar ends today, you should receive a prompt to take an evaluation survey. Please fill this out as we would greatly appreciate your feedback. If you have any other questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to us at ksuemg@ksu.edu. Thank you again and have a great rest of your week.